We're going to be giving a simple overview of MediatR and how MediatR works with the CQRS design pattern. That's the Command Query Response Segregation design pattern. So MediatR is an in-memory messenger that routes requests to handlers. It removes direct dependencies between the sender, like a controller, and the receiver, which is the business logic. So essentially what MediatR does is it puts itself in between the business logic and the controller. That way you can keep your controllers very slim, and the controller doesn't know exactly how the request is going to be handled. But MediatR will match up the type of request that comes through the controller with the handler in the business logic automatically. So when your app starts, MediatR will look through your code. It will find classes that implement these interfaces, right? We'll look at them on the next slide. And it builds an internal map of the requests to their matching handlers. So in the MediatR pattern, there are essentially there's a couple of components. There's these requests that implement the MediatR interface, which we're going to see, and there's also handlers that actually process those requests. So all of the actions, you turn your actions into data objects like DTOs. That's what they're called, data transfer objects, and they're messages, and these represent the intent of the user. So intent would mean like fetch user or get all users by ID. The purpose of that specific query or command. So these three are like the queries, which are used to read the database, commands, which mutate the database, change the database's state, and notifications, which we won't focus on right now, just commands and queries. So the first step in the this kind of MediatR pattern is to look at queries and commands. And these objects, you create DTOs, right? So we see here we have a user DTO, a user data transfer object. So we can think of this as if you have an application that's running and you want to fetch user information. So maybe it'll send a request to the API to a controller. Let's say it's the user controller, and one of these commands would be get user. So the get user action in the controller needs to know who to talk to retrieve the user information, and that's where we create these records, right? So we have this public record get user query, and it receives an ID, and this implements the iRequest interface. So this is part of the MediatR. This is the interface that we were talking about in the previous couple of slides, right? So this iRequest pattern, when your app starts, MediatR will look for these interfaces, and they'll match them automatically with their handlers, right? So essentially, what we have here is we have the iRequest pattern, and it's a generic class that implements the user DTO. So essentially, you'd create a class, a DTO. Let's say the user DTO would contain user ID, email, password, or whatever else you'd need to send to the database or retrieve from the database. Similarly, we have commands, right? So this is the same pattern, right? So this is a create user command, and it implements, again, the iRequest interface. And the user DTO and this int over here, these are kind of like the return types that MediatR will return that the controller will expect back. Your API controller calls the MediatR.send. So your API will send this message with your request. So it would send the get user query request. The controller doesn't know who will handle this request, and the controller only knows what it wants back. So that's like what we were saying before. So we have a little example here. So like we said, this is a user controller. This injects the MediatR, right? So in your program start file, you set up MediatR and stuff, and with the dependency injection, and then you just inject it into your controllers that you need. So here we have the MediatR. Excuse me. We have the user controller. So this is the user controller. We have this action here, get user, and it's getting it by ID. So we're receiving the ID into the controller. All we need to do is call MediatR.send, and we're gonna create a get user query. So this record that we had in the previous two slides, this one. So we're gonna create a new instance of this class with this ID, and we're just gonna send that to MediatR, nothing else, and then it's just gonna receive the result, and that's it. So we could see the use of this is when you set it up correctly, like the controller is incredibly slim. There's really not a lot going on in the controller, and that's kind of what we always aim for, is to keep our controllers very slim and readable. And we can see the same thing with the commands. So we have a command for a create user. We're receiving a create user command, and if we go back here, create user command, this record, it just contains the name and the email. So if you think about maybe someone registering for a service or something along those lines, they'll enter their name and their email, and then we'll send it to the controller. And this, again, we just use mediator.send, we send it off, and MediatR will handle the rest of it. Of course, we have to write the handlers, but we don't need to actually inject the specific service into the controller. And I'll show you later exactly what that would look like. And yeah. So, like we said before, MediatR looks at the map it made during startup. So essentially, like we said, when this project starts, it's going to look for these um, it's going to look for these I request uh, interfaces, and it's going to link them up with their handlers. Like it says here, it finds the single handler built for that specific object. It executes the logic in that handler, and then it returns the result to the sender. So this is the example of a handler, right? So we have an iRequest handler interface. So we have these two kind of these symmetric sides to it, the iRequest and the iRequest handler. So it's going to look for, right, since we have here, we have create user command, right? So we have this record, create user command. The iRequest handler, the create user handler will implement the iRequest handler interface that is generic too, but it also, you see here, it has the same record. It implements that record, create user command with its return type of int, right? Um, and then we can see here, now this is where we have the logic to talk to the database and stuff. And so we could see in CQRS, we're granular with our commands and our queries, right? We have one class for the create user handler or the create user command. We have a class for get user by ID. So we have all of these specific handlers for each action that we're taking. And then MediatR will look at all of these and create this map, right? So we know when the controller, wherever it is, that's the beautiful part of this, is that wherever we are, right? So here we have, let's say we have the get user. This is, we could see other use cases of this. Maybe this would be, instead of the user controller, maybe this would be in another area, the settings controller, right? The user settings controller, and we need to change some user information. We don't have to inject anything different. We could literally keep the same structure here and just inject the iMediatR and then send the get user request the same way, right? And MediatR will work in the background to link these two up without having to actually inject um, the create user handler or without having to inject the business logic into the controller, essentially. And here we can see we have a get user handler. It implements the same pattern. The iRequest handler, um, it implements the same pattern with the iRequest handler. So those are the couple of different pieces to implementing MediatR, right? So I haven't gone over any of the actual on the ground, linking it up and writing the code and stuff like that. I just wanted to give a very general overview of what MediatR is. And if we can take something away from this, it is that there are two pieces to using the MediatR pattern. It's using the iRequest and the iRequest handler. MediatR is in the middle and mediates, which is why probably it's called MediatR, mediates between, hey, we have over here, we have this iRequest type. Let me find an iRequest handler that uses it, that we can consume that and then pass the information back and forth. Now, the thing with the point of this video really is to explain MediatR, but also some of the drawbacks to using this. I find, and I'll show you with a real world example project. This is a project that I've been building. I use MediatR. I use it for some projects. For some mid-sized projects, though, I find um, MediatR gets a little too cumbersome. And what I mean by that is, if we look at, if you recall what MediatR what the MediatR pattern looks like, you're creating three classes essentially to handle one database operation, right? You're creating the record, right? The DTO. You're creating the which is the iRequest handler. Or no, you're creating the iRequest. Let's say that you have the iRequest handler, you have the iRequest interface, the thing that implements the iRequest interface, the object that implements the iRequest handler, and then in the middle of that, you also have the controller that's receiving this request, which is always going to be there anyway. Um, so you can get into this, and also using strict CQRS when you're really segregating your queries and commands for a mid-sized application, small to mid-sized application. It tends, in my opinion, it tends to be overkill. Trying to, every time that I want to, let's say, get a customer or get a user, it tends to exponentially create classes that I need to manage now. Whereas it would be simpler if I could just inject the surface directly into the controller, or use an interface to inject the interface into the controller that does a couple of different things instead of having to. And I know this is breaking design pattern, right? Because it's not strict CQRS. It's definitely not strict. It's definitely not strict clean architecture either. But I find that the practicality on the ground, it trumps sometimes the following the pure architectural design patterns and stuff like that. So here, I'm not using MediatR in this project. I like Dapper. I use Dapper for a lot of different things. Dapper is my go-to for just calling SQL. It's really simple. It's easy to set up. Even using entity framework um, is the standard, obviously, but I find that Dapper is super easy. It allows me to just write some simple SQL, define my objects, and just a really lightweight object ORM that just does everything I needed to do for simple projects. So how do I implement this in kind of like a pseudo clean architecture example without MediatR? Because now I could use MediatR here, and it would clean a lot of this up, and my controllers would be a little slimmer and stuff like that. But I don't mind having a couple extra lines in the controller, or building kind of like a different layer on top of, kind of like top of the application layer to bridge that gap. It's all comes down to functionality and usability in your specific use case. So what I have here is that the domain layer, right? This project's in its infancy, so there's nothing really more. It's not built out completely. So I have just my entities, right? I just you know I should probably name this entities, but so I just have my user, my customers, pets, products, subscriptions, users, nothing crazy going on there. So where I implement Dapper, how I implement Dapper into this kind of CQRS framework, pseudo CQRS framework, is essentially what I'll do is that I'll have, for my entities, I'll have repositories, right, for each one of my entities, and they'll contain three things, right? So if we look at customers, there's two things there, but let's see, do I have one that has the three? Here we go, subscriptions, right? So I have a subscription DTO, an interface, subscription queries, and an interface for subscription commands. So I want my Dapper and my SQL to live purely in the infrastructure layer. That's why I'm creating these interfaces here. So if we look at the DTO here, this is all the things that are this is basically the database table when I do create the database. This is going to be what the database receives. So when I call the database, this is going to be the stuff that returns to the returns from the database. That's what I use the DTO for. And then here we have in our interfaces, we just define what we want, right? So get all subscriptions, get subscription by ID, all these kinds of things. Now why I do it this way, and I've done it two different ways before. I've done it where I have the SQL in the application layer, right? So I'll in all of the setup for like the SQL client, setting up the SQL client, setting up Dapper lives in the infrastructure layer, but that doesn't change. I've done it before where instead of having these interfaces, right? Instead of having this interface, I'll actually write the SQL here, and I will pass the SQL and the connection into the infrastructure layer, which would then actually implement the connection string and actually connect to the database. This is more segregated, so there's no SQL written in my application layer. So that's what it's going to look like here, right? And then on my infrastructure side, I'll have the I don't have this the subscription on the infrastructure side, but I'll have um my queries here, and I'll write the SQL in here and stuff. Right. So this way, everything is segregated to all the actual SQL is segregated to the infrastructure layer. Um, and then I just have these interfaces here in the um, in the application layer. Generally, so like I said, I'm experimenting with this a little bit. I would usually take this connection factory and use it as an interface and pass it into here, and then have no SQL in my infrastructure layer, and have all the SQL in the application layer. But as I said again, it's just about the use cases, and you see which part which method works best for your use case. And then what I would do is that on top of that, without using MediatR, I would basically write some of these more. So if we look at the repositories, we have these repositories, get all customers. So that's just going to purely talk to the database, retrieve all the customers. That's it, right? So now if we want something a little more complicated, I build these services, and these services are kind of like handlers, except instead of having a handler per command, right? These services are kind of um, they're more controller specific, or they're more action specific, and they'll be injected into the controllers. So if we go over here, I haven't defined most of this yet, but see, we have like an identity service, right? That's going to handle logging in, logging out, generating JWT tokens and stuff like that. So um, there's kind of like a layer above the repositories that depending on, I mean, it doesn't really matter. So if you could either write your SQL in the application layer, or you could write your SQL in the infrastructure layer. Either or, there's going to be this layer on top of it that kind of orchestrates things. And so you're mimicking the MediatR pattern. I just find that it's it's more direct doing it this way. It breaks the design pattern, of course. It's not strict CQRS, absolutely not. It's not even really CQRS at all, because you're not segregating anything. It also kind of breaks the clean architecture a little bit. You can get into waters where you are mixing the application layer and the infrastructure layer a little too much. But it just seems it for me it's easier to set up, and it keeps everything simpler, instead of having to um, create these kinds of shell classes, creating these shell classes that implement the I request and I request handlers, and for each database call and stuff like that. It's easier for me to see the use case with a more hard coded with more hard coded function.